I should have known that the first crack in the peace of my little suburban life would come in the form of a mailbox. It's one of those things you never think about. Just a simple boring box at the end of your driveway, doing its duty of holding bills, junk mail, and the occasional birthday card from a distant aunt. Mine was a bit weathered, sure, a little rust around the edges, the once black paint now a faded peeling grey, but it still worked just fine. The door still closed, the flag still went up, and the mail still got delivered. In my mind, that meant it was doing its job, but apparently my HOA didn't share my practical approach to mailbox maintenance. Or, more specifically, Kerren didn't. I came home one crisp autumn afternoon to find a bright yellow violation notice taped to the side of my poor, tired mailbox, the paper flapping gently in the cool breeze like a flag of passive-aggressive warfare. I yanked it off, already feeling my blood pressure rising as I read the neat, professionally printed type. Your mailbox is in violation of community standards. Please replace or repaint immediately to avoid further fines. My jaw tightened. I glanced around the cul-de-sac, half expecting to see Kerren hiding behind a hedge, her binoculars still steaming from the intense surveillance session she must have conducted to reach this earth-shattering conclusion. But no, the street was quiet. The only sounds the rustle of leaves and the distant buzz of a leaf blower. I crumpled the notice in my fist, stuffing it into my pocket as I stomped back to my front door, muttering under my breath about power-hungry HOA dictators and their pointless, nitpicky rules. Over the next few days, I found myself glaring at my mailbox every time I pulled into my driveway. It started to feel like a personal insult, like the rusty old thing had somehow betrayed me by daring to age in plain view of Kerren's eagle eyes. I imagined her in her pristine kitchen, sipping her morning coffee while staring out her front window, her perfectly manicured nails tapping on the countertop as she plotted my next violation. I could almost hear her shrill, judgmental voice in my head. Oh, that mailbox is just dragging down property values. What will the neighbors think? And then, one particularly chilly morning as I was dragging my garbage bins to the curb, I had a thought. A wicked, wonderfully petty thought. If Kerren wanted my mailbox to be a problem, then by all means, I'd give her a problem worth complaining about. I wasn't just going to replace my rusty old mailbox. Oh no, I was going to build the biggest, boldest, most outrageously Gothic mailbox this neighborhood had ever seen. Something that would stand as a permanent, unmissable monument to my disdain for her petty HOA power trip. That weekend, I sat down with a sketch pad and a cup of strong black coffee, my mind whirling with ideas. I could see it already, a towering miniature Gothic castle, complete with crumbling stone walls, arched windows, and a tiny wrought iron portcullis over the mail slot. I'd top it off with a miniature dragon gargoyle, its wings spread wide as if ready to take flight, with glowing red eyes that would light up at night. I'd even add some faux ivy creeping up the sides for that authentic haunted castle vibe. If Kerren wanted me to replace my mailbox, I'd replace it all right, with something so over the top that she'd choke on her HOA rulebook every time she drove past. I chuckled to myself as I started sketching out the rough design, my pen flying over the paper as my vision took shape. This wasn't just going to be a mailbox. This was going to be a monument, a defiant, stone-clad middle finger to Kerren's reign of suburban terror. And as I sipped my coffee, the faint strains of organ music playing in my mind, I realized something. I was actually looking forward to this. The following weekend, I loaded up my truck with bricks, stone veneer, mortar mix, and a handful of rusty wrought iron details I found at a local salvage yard. I even picked up a gargoyle, a small, snarling beast with bat wings and a permanently suspicious expression, the perfect mascot for my mailbox castle. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Kerren's blinds snap shut across the street, a tiny, frantic movement that made me grin. Oh, she was watching. Good. I wanted her to see every painstaking stone-stacking moment of this little rebellion. The first day was all about the foundation. I dug out a solid 2-foot hole where my rusty old mailbox had stood, pouring in quick-setting concrete to form a sturdy base. I knew Kerren would be the first to measure it, so I made sure it was exactly the right height and distance from the curb, even if the rest of the structure would stretch those HOA guidelines to their breaking point. As I worked, I felt a few curious glances from my other neighbors. A couple of dog walkers slowed down, one even giving me a thumbs up as I stacked the first few rows of brick. It felt good, almost like I was building more than just a mailbox. It was a statement, a stone and mortar declaration of independence. By the second weekend, my castle was really starting to take shape. The walls had grown to about 3 feet tall, the stone veneer giving it that crumbling ancient feel I'd been going for. I'd carefully placed narrow arched windows along the sides, just big enough to let in the glow of the little LED candles I planned to install later. I even chiseled a tiny family crest above the mail slot, a snarling gargoyle clutching a bundle of letters in its claws, a symbol of my stubborn refusal to bow to Kerren's petty power plays. The gargoyle went on top next, its stony face staring straight at Kerren's house, as if daring her to march over here with another violation notice. Its eyes, a pair of blood-red glass marbles I'd picked up from a hobby shop, glinted menacingly in the afternoon sun. I couldn't help but chuckle as I stepped back to admire my work, wiping the sweat and dust from my forehead. It was over the top, ridiculous, and completely out of place in our pristine, white picket fence neighborhood. In other words, it was perfect. I could almost hear Kerren's blood pressure rising from across the street. By Sunday night, I was exhausted but deeply satisfied. I'd wired up the LED candles, tucked a tiny Bluetooth speaker into the base of the mailbox so it could play a soft, eerie organ tune whenever someone lifted the mail slot, and even planted some creeping ivy at the base, the tendrils already reaching out like tiny green fingers eager to climb their new stone home. As I stood back, beer in hand, and watched the last rays of the setting sun cast long, jagged shadows across my new Gothic masterpiece, I felt a strange, rebellious joy swell in my chest. It wasn't just a mailbox, it was a monument to my defiance, a towering castle-shaped middle finger to the entire concept of suburban conformity. And the best part, I'd done it all perfectly within HOA guidelines. I had the measurements, the setback distances, and the neatly typed laminated rulebook sitting on my kitchen counter to prove it. Let Kerren come at me with her clipboard and her sour expression. I was ready for her. The real fireworks started a few days later. I was out front, putting the final touches on my little Gothic masterpiece, a small iron portcullis over the mail slot, complete with tiny rusted chains that clinked when the wind blew. When I heard the familiar rapid-fire clack of sensible heels on pavement, I straightened up, wiping my hands on my jeans, just in time to see Kerren marching across the street, her perfectly ironed pastel blouse practically vibrating with indignation. She came to a sharp stop at the edge of my driveway, clipboard clutched so tightly in her talon-like fingers that I half expected it to snap in two. I had to resist the urge to lean against my new stone fortress and smirk. "What?" she hissed, her nostrils flaring like an angry racehorse. "Is this?" She jabbed her clipboard in the direction of my mailbox, her eyes as wide as saucers. I glanced at the Gothic tower, its stone walls gleaming in the morning sun, the gargoyle's crimson eyes glowing faintly from their recessed sockets. I had even set up a tiny drawbridge-style door over the mail slot, complete with iron hinges and a miniature rusted chain for dramatic effect. "This?" I said, feigning innocence. "Oh, this is my new mailbox. You said the old one was an eyesore, so I figured I'd go with something a little more timeless." Her eyes narrowed, the clipboard shaking slightly in her grip. This monstrosity is completely out of character for this neighborhood," she snapped, her voice climbing in pitch. It's... She seemed to struggle for the right word, her eyes darting over the gargoyle, the faux stone walls, and the creeping ivy that had already started to snake its way up the sides. "It's a violation of every design principle this community stands for. I couldn't help but chuckle, crossing my arms as I leaned back against my castle. Actually, I said, drawing the word out just long enough to watch her face twist with barely suppressed rage, it's completely within HOA guidelines. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out the laminated copy of the HOA rulebook I'd been carrying around like a lucky charm, flipping it open to the mailbox section. See here, maximum height, check. Proper setback from the curb, check. Sturdy with a proof construction, check. I gave her a slow, satisfied smile. And nowhere in this entire section does it say anything about not being allowed to have a little architectural flair. She blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as she scanned the page, her eyes flicking rapidly from line to line as if hoping to find some forgotten clause, some obscure technicality that would allow her to smite my creation. But of course, there was nothing. I had planned this down to the last detail, every inch of my stone and metal fortress perfectly within the limits set by the HOA. I even had receipts for the materials and a signed statement from my neighbor Phil, a retired contractor, confirming the mailbox was structurally sound. You can't, she spluttered, her face turning a blotchy shade of red. This is a disgrace to the entire neighborhood. I shrugged, leaning in a little closer so she could see the faint scratches and chipped paint on my work gloves. Well, Kerren, maybe next time you shouldn't find someone for a little rust and peeling paint. You never know how they might choose to express their creativity. I could see the gears grinding in her head, her jaw tightening as she realized she had no real ground to stand on. I had won this round, and she knew it. But as she spun on her heel and stormed back across the street, her sensible shoes crunching furiously over the sidewalk, I had a feeling this wasn't the last I'd hear from her. For a few days, things were blissfully quiet. I'd come home from work, pull into my driveway, and be greeted by the sight of my glorious Gothic mailbox, standing tall, its gargoyle sentry glaring defiantly at Kerren's house. I even noticed a few of the other neighbors slowing down as they passed, their eyes lingering on the castle, some with amused smirks, others with barely concealed envy. It was, by every measure, a triumph. But of course, Kerren wasn't the type to admit defeat so easily. The storm came on a grey, drizzly Thursday morning. I was sipping my coffee by the front window, watching the raindrops streak down the glass, when I saw a white HOA van pull up in front of my house. Out stepped Kerren, clipboard in hand, her hair plastered down by the damp air, but her stride as determined as ever. Behind her, a second figure emerged, a wiry, bespectacled man in a cheap windbreaker and a hard hat. I watched it as they trudged up my driveway, stopping in front of my mailbox, the hard hat guy pulling a tape measure from his belt. I sighed, setting my coffee down and grabbing my coat. I knew this wasn't going to be a friendly chat. By the time I reached them, the guy was on one knee, stretching the tape measure from the base of the mailbox to the top of the gargoyle, his brow furrowed in concentration. Kerren stood behind him, her lips twisted into a smug little smile as she caught sight of me. "I see you've brought reinforcements," I said, folding my arms and leaning against the damp brick of my front porch. "What's the matter, Kerren? Your clipboard not intimidating enough on its own?" She shot me a withering glare, her eyes narrowing as the windbreaker guy stood up, his tape measure snapping back into its housing with a sharp click. "Mr. Thompson," Kerren said, her voice dripping with forced politeness, "we've had a professional inspection conducted on your mailbox, and I'm afraid it's been found to be in violation of several key structural and safety regulations." I raised an eyebrow, glancing at the hard hat guy, who suddenly found the cracks in my driveway very interesting. "Oh, really?" I said, biting back a smirk. "Do tell." She straightened, flipping open her clipboard and scanning her notes with an air of barely contained glee. "First of all," she said, tapping her pen against the paper, "your mailbox exceeds the maximum height limit by approximately 4 inches. The gargoyle poses a potential safety hazard to pedestrians, and the iron portcullis you've installed could potentially injure a postal worker." I had to give her credit. She'd done her homework, but so had I. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my laminated HOA rulebook like a sword from a sheath. "Actually, Kerren," I said, holding it out to her, "according to this very rulebook, the height measurement is taken from the base of the mailbox structure to the point where the mail slot is accessible, which, as you can see, I gestured to the tiny iron gate, is well within the required limits. Her jaw tightened, her eyes darting from the gargoyle to the rulebook and back again. I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. And as for the gargoyle, I continued, my tone dripping with faux concern, it's made of lightweight resin, not stone, so it poses no more of a safety hazard than one of those ridiculous lawn gnomes your husband insists on putting out every spring. The hard hat guy coughed awkwardly, clearly regretting whatever lowball contract had brought him into this suburban nightmare. I leaned in a little closer, dropping my voice to a whisper that I knew would cut right through Kerren's brittle facade. And the portcullis? Well, I checked with the postmaster, and it turns out they actually appreciate the added bit of flair. Said it brightened their route a little. I straightened, flashing her a smile that had just a hint of teeth. So unless you've got something a little more substantial, then I don't like it. I'm afraid your little crusade against my mailbox castle is about as dead as a medieval drawbridge. Kerren's face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, frustration, and finally that tight-lipped, silent fury that I had come to enjoy so much. Without another word, she snapped her clipboard shut, spun on her heel, and stomped back to the HOA van, her hard hat accomplice trailing behind her like a scolded child. I watched them drive off, the white van disappearing around the corner with a faint squeal of tires. I took a deep breath, feeling the damp air fill my lungs, the faint smell of wet earth and stone wafting up from my Gothic masterpiece. I turned back to my mailbox, its gargoyle still staring defiantly at Kerren's house, its eyes glowing faintly in the grey morning light. I chuckled, giving the stone beast a pat on the head as I headed back inside. "Well, old friend," I muttered, "looks like we won this round."